Welcome to the James Bond Book Club. Hosted by me, John Bleasdale. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the James Bond Book Club. My name's John Bleasdale, and I'm a writer and critic. This is the last time we're going to be doing a straight episode of James Bond by Ian Fleming. We're talking about Octopussy and other stories, and I'm delighted to be joined by Laurence Boyce, a film critic and writer and a festival programmer. Lovely to have you in my lair, Mr. Boyce.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bleasdale. I've been expecting you.
We talked about James Bond, I think, when we first met in Tallinn, which is a kind of very James Bond place to be in Estonia.
It is. Bond has never been set here. The closest I think we have is Goldfinger, where I think they describe Goldfinger as a bolt. I think he's meant to be from Riga, is the idea, which is just up the road. But as whilst it would seem a perfect place, Our Man in Havana, for example, by Graham Greene, at one point was going to be called Our Man in Tallinn. So there is a history of Cold War and espionage and people being inspired by the lovely place in which I now call my home. But Bond itself has only peripherally touched the Baltic.
Yeah, I can't help but hear that sort of harpsichordy, ziffery sort of espionage music that you would get.
Exactly.
Maybe more with Harry Palmer and sort of something like the $1 Billion Brain.
No, exactly. It's sort of it does seem to suit the snowy winters and the dark nights.
Yeah, and what's your backstory with James Bond? What was your first encounter via film or from
it was via film, and I did have a bit of a story, and trust me, everybody listening, he does come back to a point, I promise. Like many, I was a fan of Bond films. For me, Timothy Dalton was my Bond. Just from that was the Bond I grew up with, Living Daylights, appropriate today, License to Kill. But I also had a thing that I was partly raised by my grandfather, my grandparents. And he had a little, he and my grandparents went to a community centre, where you do whist and you do ballroom dancing, shout out to the Wellington Rural Residents Association in Leeds. And one of the things that he did is that he ran a little bookstall. He used to store some shelves, ask all the members to donate books, and every month he would drag these shelves out and drag all these books and put them on for sale in the foyer for 10p each. And I used to go help him. And you can imagine, with a large clientele of older people mostly, you would find a lot of Bond books, and I would get all the pan editions. And for when you're at 8 or 9, knowing a Bond, and you would see, one of the things I don't know you've really talked about, they're really striking, some of the pan editions, these sort of, I'm looking at Octopussy now, this butterfly on a gold bar, and they've really struck me. Now, ironically, I never really got on with the books when I was younger, because they seemed really dry and dusty. You're watching the Bond films, it's contemporaneous. You're reading the Bond books, and they're talking about the war. As you mentioned in the past, Casino Royale and the car, which is basically the Monopoly car. And it seems very out of kilter from what you know culturally of James Bond. And so I sort of distanced myself from them. And it was ironically, I think, stuff like reading Benson and John Gardner that I started to read, where you read Bond as contemporaneous character. And then later on, I got back into Fleming, and I started to really appreciate Fleming as a writer, Bond as a literary character, and how he worked away from the filmic character that we'd all got used to.
It's a really strange thing. When you're a kid, your idea of modernity is obviously the up to the minute, rocket packs and motorboats and things like that, most of which don't appear in the books. But then you go back to the books, and there's the idea that they were boring is so weird, because they're absolutely jam-packed of stuff with stuff to do.
They're really exciting. It's just that there's this, I think, immediacy. And again, the filmic character has an immediacy that the literary character doesn't. And because of that, I think when you're young, it's easy to sort of be a bit more dismissive of Fleming and the literary Bond. And I think there is a more of an appreciation that comes with age. So I've always liked the Bond character, and I was always a Bond fan. but I became a Fleming fan a bit later.
Covers that you talk about, which funnily enough, is probably the whole reason I started doing this podcast, was because I had a sudden nostalgia for exactly those. I think there was a second edition pen paperbacks. The first edition was sort of painterly, and the second edition was a series of photographs with the big font James Bond at the top, and then the title halfway down, "Live and Let Die," on a Majesty's Secret Service, with the ring in the snow being a prime example of a beautiful example of those designs. Yeah, it was sort of a sudden hankering about getting those almost as objects, which led me to buy them through secondhand book sites and whatnot. And then because I had them, I thought, well, I'll read them. And because I was reading them again, I thought, well, I better do a podcast. So
I was recollecting them. I'm one of these because again I'm originally from Leeds in the UK, but I moved to Estonia. So I'm one of these people who has, again, I'm also have lots and lots of books, and now I have some in the UK, I have some here, and some I don't know where I have, etc., etc., etc. And I have slowly been getting all the Bond books back into my collection. Sometimes going home, picking one up, but then seeing one in a second-hand store or whatever. And I have a rag bag of different editions. I've got the vintage, and I've got an American edition of Doctor No, for example. But funnily enough, I picked up a bunch of the Pan books in Helsinki, in the Helsinki Airport bookstore. And my copy of Goldfinger is actually quite sweet because it's still got somebody has pasted an original advert for Goldfinger in Finnish, the cinema release. So there's like a newspaper cinema release advert is pasted into the book. And also within the Goldfinger book, it's lots of underlined and Finnish words where the person is obviously trying to use the book to learn English. So he's been sort of underlying, or she has been underlying words that they don't understand, putting it into Finnish and trying to work out what it is, which I think is, I mean, this is obviously Fleming and Bond, but I think that's also the great thing about books in general. There is something about things, which I actually think will be germane to the conversation that we're going to have as well. There is something about having things and items, and there is something about the Bond books and those Pan editions. But I would happily, I've already got that, but I don't have that edition. I could have 15 copies of Octopussy or whatever it is.
I'm definitely on for getting the first edition paperback copies as well, and all the covers. I'm quite happy to have two whole sets of Bond with those specific covers. There were covers in the 80s which I was none too keen on, which were just white backgrounds and a gun and a girl in a bikini on each one, and they were not attractive covers or objects.
Sometimes they don't try. Like I think the Penguin version, the modern version of "You Only Live Twice," or "Live and Let Die." No, "Live and Let Die" is a shark, which is a bit obvious. But one of them is just Connery. One of them is just stick Connery. Whereas, like good book covers, you like it to be a bit more abstract, doing things that are a little bit more intelligent.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's talk about Octopussy now, because this is a collection of short stories which is published posthumously. There are only three short stories in the UK edition, which is in the Pan edition that we've read. So, which is Octopussy, Property of a Lady, and The Living Daylights. Other editions also include James Bond in New York, which is a separate short story. And each of these short stories have been written at different times in the career. It's not like they were all at the end. It wasn't like he finished Man with a Golden Gun and wrote three short stories and then keeled over, clutching his chest. These were sort of unpublished, but they'd been done. I think one had been done just before on Her Majesty's Secret Service, and another. I know that The Property of a Lady was written specifically for Sotheby's.
It's the Ivory Hammer.
Yeah,
So that was Sotheby's auction house yearbook.
yeah. I mean, so what do you know about maybe you can talk a little bit more about the sort of the composition of these stories.
So I know Octopussy, that was published posthumously, and I think it was first published in Playboy.
Right.
I think it was Playboy and maybe in the UK in the Express. I think they were serialized in the papers after Fleming's death. Then, as we say, Property of a Lady that we got was commissioned for the Ivory Hammer, which is a Sotheby's Auction House yearbook, which, as we'll go on to see, explains maybe some of the direction that the story takes itself. The Living Daylights was first published in 1962, which is the first issue of the Sunday Times colour magazine. So obviously they were looking for something bright and shiny. I think it had the title Berlin Escape. It was called something different. It was named The Living Daylights when it came to publication. And 007 in New York, which is in the modern editions of this short story collection, it was published in New York because I think it was the New York Herald Tribune was asking Fleming to do the travelogues that ended up becoming Thrilling Cities. And when Thrilling Cities was published as a book in America, they added this 007 in New York as a sort of extra bonus chapter. It was actually technically published in Britain for the first time in 1999. It never officially appeared in the UK until the end of the century. And then they stuck it into the collections of Octopussy after that, where it became a sort of mainstay of the collections. So you can see it's a rag bag because, again, Property of a Lady is, if I'm correct, is set between On Her Majesty's and You Only Live Twice. You've got The Living Daylights, which is set between The Spy Who Loved Me and On Her Majesty's. And as we've been talking throughout the James Bond Book Club, idea is that, you see this gradation and change of Bond. Whereas it's a little bit harder with this one because you have a staccato, you're going back. There's not necessarily a deliberate, this is an extension of the character. This is a little bit more, here's a few bits that we've pulled together from various other places. So it gives you more of a sideways look at the character.
Yeah, even For Your Eyes Only is kind of set within the same period. It's set within the same year. And so you have, can't remember if it's 5 stories, and they're happening more or less chronologically and between the gaps of two novels.
And here it just feels that little staccato. Again, this was published posthumously. I don't know whether if Fleming was alive, he would have allowed these stories to be put together like this. And it was just a bunch of publishers saying, hey, quick, let's get another few books out of him by putting these stories together. So there's sort of no rhyme and reason necessarily for these stories, apart from the fact they're James Bond short stories that weren't published before.
And it's a pretty small collection. I mean, as we say, only three stories in the original publication. That's it's about 150 pages in my edition. Let's start with the first though. Octopussy is, I mean, the short story this most resembles to me is Quantum of Solace, I think, in that we start with other characters, and really James Bond is somebody who is almost a sort of audience to another story playing out. But I think the difference between this and Quantum of Solace is that although in Quantum of Solace, if listeners recall, Quantum of Solace is where he listens to the story of a couple who start off in love. He marries an air hostess, a guy in a station in the West Indies, and their marriage goes south, and various things happen, and really Bond is just listening, except that he walks away thinking, well, maybe lives of normal people are more glamorous or more full of drama than my life is, which is an interesting take from it. But in this story, there's actually something very fundamental at stake for Bond. It's just buried.
I think for Bond, it's interesting that Bond says something which reveals quite a lot you don't usually have, which is he's talking about Oberhauser, saying he was a father figure for me at a time when I needed one quite a lot. And we often talk, or the Bond novels often talk about the nature of revenge, the nature of what is acceptable. And Bond spends his time usually in the novels wrestling with guilt over for your eyes only, him going to kill the people who killed the Havelocks. Is it morally right that he does so? Is M right? Is this a personal revenge mission, etc., etc., etc.? And it's interesting in this one that Bond is there because he has a personal stake in it as well. But the way in which he deals with it, the idea is, I'm not here to kill you, I'm not here to take you away, I'm here to tell you that I know the secret behind what happened with you and the gold, and I'm going to let you decide what's going to happen. And I think that's interesting because it has, again, Bond as this. It's interesting because Bond, in some of these stories that have also happened in the past, sometimes doesn't have agency. But for once he does have an agency, he's actually there driving everything for once by going, I know what's going on. It is up to you to deal with it now. I'm going to be nice enough not to drag you in irons or shoot you in the middle of it.
There was another take as well that I found interesting in reading this. And I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this. So the main character, Major Dexter Smythe, is this out of shape British commando who can just about fit into his trousers if he's already had a heart attack, a coronary, and is on his way. He's on borrowed time. He knows that and he hasn't changed his lifestyle. All his friends are saying, why don't you look after yourself? But he's drinking as much. He's just woken up from a terrible hangover. He's obviously an alcoholic. And I couldn't help, as I was reading this, of thinking, is this Fleming writing a really sort of self-loathing portrait?
I don't know if you know that. I don't know if he's been mentioned in the book club before, but Philip Larkin has actually been mentioned before. And I don't know if you know that Larkin reviewed this. He reviewed Octopussy and when it was first published, which I think is, again, ironic. Two big literary British literary cultural touchstones, just very, very different, but they sort of seem to collide. And once again, Larkin was alluded to, I think, in previous podcasts as well. And Larkin makes that point as well. Because even if you think about what Smythe is doing, it's Fleming. Because what is Smythe doing? Every so often, shaving off a piece of gold, and he's getting his money, and he's living for the next year. That's just like Fleming. Every year, sits down, goes to Jamaica, sits there, knocks off a Bond novel, gets his money, has another year in which to live, nicely. So he said, and Larkin makes this point. The Food Brothers, they're basically just his publishers for all intents and purposes. And I think that is a good point because it does sound like Fleming. Even though the character of Dexter Smythe is definitely written as basically a horrible, horrible person, he doesn't give him really any. He gives him a sort of sheen of amiability, but he does enough when you read it just to know that he's a thoroughly despicable human being. From the death of Oberhauser, which is just dealt with in a couple of. There is a great sequence, I think, in this book, and it's him getting the gold down the mountain. And from that moment when he kills Oberhauser with just this clinical, 2 shots in the head, over he goes. Now I've got to, get the gold. I'm going to sit on the thing and eat Oberhauser's garlicky, fatty sausage whilst his body is now rotting away. It's a great, it's a great piece of writing. And throughout it all, Smythe is he's quite horrible. It's Smythe sort of narrating it, and he has this sort of amiability, but you read everything, he's like, you're just a thoroughly despicable person. Again, the entire thing with his wife, for all intents and purposes, causing her suicide. And even, the end of it, when he's given a way out, and there's the dramatic irony of he decides, I'm going to get away with it. I'm going to get away with this. I'm going to throw myself to the court. I didn't do any of this nasty stuff. I didn't shoot anybody or anything like that. I'll get away with it. I'll be fine. And then the fates of divine justice come in, and he gets stung by the scorpion. So I think there is a lot of Fleming there, but even I don't think Fleming was that down on himself. You know what I mean? I think Fleming knew of some of the criticisms that he had as a human being and indeed as a writer. But I see a lot of Fleming in Smythe, but I also don't see the truly despicable stuff within the character as being Fleming, because I do think he is. There are just a few lines which show you how awful he is as an actual person.
Yeah, it could almost be something from a Roald Dahl's story or something. I mean, it's and given that Fleming does have this life in Jamaica, it could just as easily be someone he's meeting in the club, someone he's his depiction of Jamaican society. You're only four miles away from the capital, but you're in a different world already. So it could easily just be someone he knows, or knows of, as a self-portrait. But yeah, I do like the fact that it feels like he's sailing close to the wind.
I think so, but there's also, I mean, there is a line he said when Bond has come to visit him as well, and he says, "I'll be outside and I'll wait for you to come and tell me." He says, and I'll quote: "He sat and drank and marshaled his thoughts. He could make the story long or short, put in the weather and the way the flowers and pines had smelled on the mountains, or he could cut it short. He would cut it short." But that's Fleming. That is, what would he do? He would tell you the weather and the smell of the pines and the mountains and things like that. It is sort of Fleming describing himself as a writer in many ways, which I think is really interesting. It is, I think, him in some ways confronting who he is and who he's seen as a writer, and maybe in some ways working through what would it be like if Bond in real life came to confront him.
Yeah, that's really. I mean, it does have this meta idea of sort of
Because
Bond.
he's not been ashamed of doing that.
No,
You know, the I think with the man with the golden gun, there's an allusion to the Ian, somebody who was allowed to write my stories. He's always been allowed to do that, and he's always been afraid to do it. And I think there is a little bit of that going on.
yeah, yeah. It'd be so interesting to put this at the end of the collection, and it's literally James Bond turning up to kill Ian Fleming.
Because again, and this is partly to do with Larkin, it's like that whilst Fleming, as far as we know, I haven't read any contemporaneous autobiographies lately, hasn't murdered anybody. But again, it's that idea of he was at the SOE in the World War, and he's taking all these experiences of, in some ways, of death and destruction and secrecy, and he takes all those and he marshals them into stories, into books, and he puts them all together. So is this guilt? Is this probably a little step too far on that? But it still seems an interesting, slight self-reflection. And also, again, you have the whole thing of the the entire, I'm trying to think of the right word, the aquatic nature of the story, which is first of all is Fleming almost to a T. Though Fleming hated, unless he really needed to, I think, killing things. He wouldn't have been totally on board with Smythe's indiscriminate killing of whatever he just felt like. Because I seem to remember reading Fleming was quite opposed to doing so unless you really needed to do so.
Yeah, and that recalls the Hildebrand rarity. The guy dropping poison bombs to kill all the fish.
And even the way, it's very weird thing of the inciting central thing of the thing is that he needs to feed a scorpion fish to the Octopussy to send it to was it the museum or the institute or something like that?
Yes.
To see whether it would survive or not and see what would happen. That's also, and again, that's a little bit of a person looking for a legacy. If I do this, maybe I'll be remembered in the annals of some book somewhere because I helped them discover that the octopus survived or didn't, etc., etc., etc. There's a regret to a life that maybe he enjoyed, but is in his twilight years in pain. Was it all worth it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I also think going back to the wartime moment as well, the fact that he belongs to this strange group called the what's it called? The Miscellaneous Objects Bureau or something, but the acronym is MOB.
Yeah,
So there's this sort of like that has an SOE sort of
exactly.
improvised Boy Scouts out on a jolly, feel to it.
And there's that idea that he was in the war, but he wasn't. Even the way in which he takes Oberhauser away, for interrogation, and because he can, but he's following the front line. He's never there at the front line usually.
Yes.
He's following it to go in and sweep it up. Because I do think that was something that was part of the SOE's job, and something that Fleming himself helped to bring in that wasn't really done before. It's part of the job to go in to places that had just been liberated and take all the documents, to make sure that documents were found, to make sure that they weren't burned, to make sure that they weren't. So anything that was secret, anything like that, could be kept and used, and maybe would reveal enemy positions, etc., etc., etc. So again, that sort of thing, Fleming had form for. That he'd done that. This idea that you'd go in and was probably, they were sort of. I think they were, and again, my brain is escaping me slightly, but again, they were sort of slightly looked down on by infantrymen and other soldiers, because the infantrymen and everybody would go in and do all the hard work, and then they would sweep in behind them and pick up all the detritus and all the cool stuff.
Yeah, it was like the desk jockeys, getting out from behind the desk, but when all the bullets have been shot and fired and the danger is gone.
And so I think that's what is interesting about this story, because Bond is so central to it, yet so peripheral as well. And again, we talked about but there's a sort of inverse. We talked about how in some of the stories, Bond is sort of there and central to it, but his actual agency and how he drives the plot is negligible. He's just there and here it's a little bit inverted, that he's not really there. He's sort of, as a character, he's not in it that much, but actually his entire thing of coming does drive everything that happens within the story.
Yeah, I mean, I was wondering about that. I was wondering about even if there's any real need for him to be there, as in the only reason he's turning up is almost like in an unofficial capacity. And I almost got the feeling he was wanting to kill Smythe and just wanted to size him up and thought, okay, this guy actually isn't worth. I just wanted to look the man in the eyes and see what he was like. Yeah, it's that sense of personal vendetta that he's not going to act on, but it feels there. And I mean, this goes further in the Living Daylights as well, and it kind of extends to something we've talked throughout the book club of James Bond's remarkable reluctance to kill people. That he really doesn't. But I mean, is it in the telling of the story he really genuinely thinks this guy's gonna sort of fall on his sword, which in the end doesn't happen? So even
But he does. You see, this is the irony of the book, because everybody thinks he does. There's an
yeah.
idea. I think that people think. I think there's a final line that makes it slightly ambiguous.
Hmm.
If I quickly look at the final line of, and just bear with me a second, I find the final line. Later in London, James Bond, privately assuming suicide, wrote the same verdict of found drowned. It is only from the notes of Dr. Greaves, who performed the autopsy, that it is possible to construct some kind of postscript to the bizarre and pathetic end of a once valuable officer of the Secret Service. There's a slight ambiguity there that actually suggests they found something that might have suggested that it wasn't suicide and he did die accidentally. But the idea is that there is a certain irony that, again, he goes, I'll get away with this. I'm going to write this one out. I'll be fine. This secret agent has just made me, and as I say, then he gets stung and he dies horribly. In another very sort of James Bond moralistic, that's what you get for being a git,
Yeah.
to put it mildly.
Good choice of words.
Yeah. Yes, very Bondy, I'm sure.
Well, usually Fleming's
But
that. But what does Fleming say in "You Only Live Twice"? He sort of says something like Frederick Uber Claire and Catherine or something. He has an acronym that he tells Tiger. I can't remember what it is exactly. Frederick Hugo.
I couldn't do the F and the long line and the K in language, so I'll
Yeah.
just say that instead. But I think that, and again, I think that just final line gives it some ambiguity about whether they actually discovered whether it's a suicide or not.
I've been using the James Bond, The Man and His World, the official companion to Ian Fleming's creation, as I've been researching
Hmm.
and following this by Henry Chancellor. Very kindly sent to me by Alistair Satchel, I have to say. And in the synopsis of Octopussy, it says, "Oh, he commits suicide." And I was thinking, hang on a minute, I read this yesterday. So I went back and reread it. And he doesn't, he certainly doesn't intentionally get spiked. I mean, he doesn't even notice that he's actually got the spine in him until like some 30, 40 seconds later, and then he starts noticing something, and he looks down and there are little porcupine spines in his chest, and he has to pull them out, and then it's like, okay, now I know I'm going to be dead.
There's again a huge irony that he's quite depressed and quite down. He talks about how he's been waiting for ages for the hammer to drop, basically, that
Mm.
somebody knows. One of these days, somebody's going to find out. And it might link in with because again, talking about the similarities between Fleming and Smythe and other characters, he also is, I never know how to pronounce it, but he's another sufferer of acidi or acidi.
Yes,
The
exactly.
same as Mr. Big, same as Blofeld, same as Fleming himself would say that he had from. And yet, when he's found out and he goes back into the ocean, it's like he's got a new lease of life, which again paints him as not a nice character because he's basically said, he found me out, but actually, you know what? Again, I'll style it out. But that's
Challenge.
actually, I'll go with it. I'll throw myself on the mercy of the court. I'll tell everybody that Oberhauser was evil and nasty and was going to kill me. I don't know exactly how we will then explain stealing the money, finding off the right marks and everything like that. But, each to their own. But there's this idea of him going, yeah, Bond's got nothing on me, leading to this ironic and nasty death, which is again goes back to that evil villains deserve nasty deaths. That does happen in the Bond films, and I think happens in the Bond books as well.
Yeah, ultimately the universe is a just place.
And I think that is another thing about Bond. There is an idea about sometimes justice and what is right. There is a moral attitude, which is ironic considering that, contemporaneous reviews of Fleming were he's partly responsible for the decline of Western civilization, for all his sex and violence and sadism. There
Sadism.
was, there's always been a huge moralistic streak, actually, about certain ideas of what right and wrong are. And again, I think that does sort of work within Octopussy. There's a karmic justice for a character who is given a way out. He doesn't think he's going to take it, but then karma and life decides to take it for him anyway.
Let's talk briefly about Property of a Lady. I know this hasn't got quite the depth of Octopussy in terms of moral content, but as we were talking about earlier, this was written sort of as a commission, which also to some degree, the interesting thing I've been thinking about recently with reading these stories specifically is how Fleming's always sort of trying to spin Bond into different commercial prospects. So you've got comic scripts, you've got film scripts, you've got television scripts, and you've even got him sort of trying to appeal to things like, okay, well, I can get published in Playboy, and that's a big payday for me, so I'll do it in a certain way. And then this one has got to be the most bizarre in that, yeah, as you said, the in-house auctioneer's magazine essentially, or yearbook.
What I find interesting about Property of a Lady is that in some ways that it really does highlight, I think, in some ways what made Fleming work and also why he didn't work as sometimes as an author. The story itself is again, because of the very nature, the way it's commissioned, it's basically about there is a double agent who needs to be paid So how are they going to pay this double agent? You can't take it into a bank account because that will be obvious. So they're going to send her this big Fabergé egg, which also sounds a bit weird and obvious, but there we go. We'll go with that plan. Then she's going to take it to auction. She'll sell it for a load of money. And if she does that, she'll be rich. But they decide to follow her because then they'll be able to identify, hopefully, the person who's the head of basically the local KGB branch
Yeah.
in the UK. It's very sort of simple idea. But a lot of it does sort of lay bare what Bond is good at and what Fleming was good at, and sometimes what he wasn't good at. If you look at the Bond of the films and how we react to the Bond of the films, he's almost like superhuman, especially if you think about the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. You know, he would walk into M's office and he would go, good evening, 007, tell me about mining conditions in 1776 to 1777 in Kuala Lumpur. And he would know because he was James Bond and he was amazing. And there is something that actually Kingsley Amis points out in the Bond dossier is that what you see of the Bonds in the books and why I think you can be attracted to them is because you see the work that goes into it. That, you know, if you look at the books, it's often, you know, he'll be sat in his office and he'll be reading, oh, these are all the reports about the cyanide gas that is being used. There's this thing. There's a huge moment in the books. Dr. No, when they're preparing to go to Crab Key, which is basically the literary equivalent of a montage sequence in an 80s action film. You know, he has to prepare, he has to read. And what you see in the books is that he is good at what he does, but part of the reason he is good at what he does is because he sits and he reads and he learns. On Her Majesty's Secret Service, you know, all that stuff about heraldry is Bond applies himself to be able to learn about this stuff to do his job. And this is partly within The Property of a Lady. He needs to learn about Fabergé and auction houses and everything like that. And that is very much like Fleming. I reject, there is an orthodoxy that Fleming was terrible at writing people and writing characters. I disagree with that, but I will agree, I don't think it was his strongest point. I think he was more comfortable because of his journalistic background with things. You gave him things, you gave him facts, you gave him things to work with. And it would put him, I think, on a much more even plane. There's again, on the back of the book, there's a quote. I wasn't able to find the full review, but Anthony Burgess, the listener, and he says, two stories, which they're fascinating, pouring on things, guns, techniques, and foodstuffs, remind us that it is the mastery of the world of things rather than people that gives Fleming his peculiarly literary niche. And I always thought that that's what makes Fleming such a good writer and sometimes also causes his problems. There is a push and a pull between his journalistic instinct and his... I don't think he was an actual writer or an actual literary writer. I think he had to drag it up from himself. He was a natural journalist. And he always tried to find those two worlds. And I think that's why we do like Bond, because there's this fantastic ridiculousness to them all, but because he grounds them so within a world of things, of descriptions, that we take it. And especially for audiences of the 50s and 60s and 70s living in austerity, they added an extra frisson. And The Property of a Lady is, in a way, a little bit of an thing of that, because again, you have all these explanations. What Fabergé egg is, this is how auction houses work. It's even, Peter Wilson, who is mentioned, was the Sotheby's real life chairman. It's that typical Fleming thing of putting in real facts, real things, doing his research to hang a story around it. Admittedly, the story is quite slight. And again, Bond there's a bit in it when M goes, do not start bidding, Bond. Do not do that. We know he does it in Octopussy, because this is also used in the film Octopussy when he does. And you would expect Bond to go wading in and bid against and he doesn't. He just sits there.
If this was going to be a novel, that's where it would start. Would be with him. I knew M had told me not to start bidding, but I can't let this go.
And in this one, he just says, "Yeah, I'm not going to start bidding." Oh, look, that's him. And then he basically gets in the cab and goes back to the office. That's it. You know what I mean? But I think it's a story filled with facts and ideas, and not exactly Wikipedia. We've talked about it before. That how things can be, sometimes Fleming can turn into Wikipedia.
Yeah,
And again, that
cut
was
and
partly because,
paste.
it is for the Ivory Hammer. It has to have a certain thing about it to be able to go in this very weird place where it went. But I think it's an interesting little thing that puts into sharp relief sometimes about Fleming's approach to things. It is funny. I don't know if you know that he refused to take payment for the story.
Oh,
He
right.
was really dissatisfied with it, and he refused to take payment. I don't know exactly why he was dissatisfied, but he didn't like it himself so much that
You see,
he.
if I had been Ian Fleming, I would have put it out to the highest bidder. He could have.
I mean, and again, Fleming was usually not backwards in coming forwards about liking to getting a bit of cash here and there.
Yeah, yeah. I really like your point about James Bond as a kind of journalist, in that he sort of does his research, goes abroad and gets the story, I mean, it's like, what if you gave a journalist a gun? That would kind of be James Bond, right?
Because again, you see that he has to work on it. As I say, the Bond of the films is almost preternaturally superhuman. He's a great shot. He's a good womanizer. He's again, you go back to think of Moonraker in the card game before Moonraker. You actually Bond is at home and he takes these books that he's got about card games out and he practices his shuffle. You always see the connective tissue in the literary Bond, and I think that's almost why you relate to the literary Bond in a slightly different way to the cinematic Bond. The cinematic Bond is the entire the superhero. Men want to be him, women want to be with him, binary thing that is. Whereas Bond of the literary is that you could say, I know he's really good, but you could aspire to be like Bond if you put the work,
Yeah.
if you actually work, if you did the research, because you see that with Bond.
He even has to do exercises. I mean, you see him go and do press ups and stuff. And like in Live and Let Die, he has to have a week of swimming and exercising and only drinking 5 packets of fags a day rather than 10 to get in shape to do to meet Mr. Big in his lair. I was just wondering if it would be, I mean, obviously not if Ian Fleming refused to take payment for this story, but I can think of a fantasy island in which Fleming said yes to loads of different things and wrote loads of short stories of like
Yeah.
Bond investigates fish and chips in for Fish and Chips Weekly.
And he would have found a way to, because the fish came from Russia and the uh, Russian economy was very reliant on these fish, and therefore we needed to destabilize the use of these fish. He would have found, and it would have been this, and again, this is what Fleming did. Is, I think it is fair to say some of his characterization and some of his plotting could be shonky. I think, it's because I think partly because he did like to hang around things around reality. And also sometimes I think with his past, working with the SOE, a lot of the Bond films, the Bond books are about luck. Not just about the luck of a game, but Bond walks in the wrong direction and the bad guys catch him. And I think with somebody working for the SOE, he would have been battle plans and stuff like that. The wind blows in the wrong direction, and because of that, a battle was. He believed in sort of that there were actually things of luck or just pure coincidence that actually happen in real life, but don't sometimes work within the. It's what I call the Hacksaw Ridge thing. Have you ever seen the film Hacksaw Ridge with Andrew
Yeah,
Garfield?
Mel Gibson directed. Yeah.
The one. So what it's about is about a soldier who refused to take up arms, but said, "I'll be a paramedic. I'm a pacifist. I refuse to fight in the war, but I will be a paramedic." Now, in real life, this was basically real life stuff, and there are apparently extraordinary incidences of this person. He dragged somebody off the battlefield down a mountain on a stretcher. He was shot in the leg, but he went back up and he grabbed somebody else and dragged them down the mountain. And it was never used in the film. And the reason it was never used in the film is because they said they would never believe it. Even though it happened in real life, the audiences would not believe it. And I think there are certain things with Fleming where he believed in that things just happen. There is luck. There are things that happen on a whim because he's probably seen it. He's probably seen how it happened. But it doesn't necessarily work within a literary construct. And so there was always, as I say, this push and pull between how Fleming built the world with his journalistic flair, with his talking about things and places, and how there was sometimes, and those I think made him why he is a writer that we still remain today, because they helped gloss over some of the more problematic things of characterization. And when he had to pick things out of the air, I think he found it harder.
I totally agree with that. I think that I think the luck as a superpower for Bond is he's I mean we'll talk about him being a great shot in a moment, but that's something that sort of develops later. When you meet him in Casino Royale, he's kind of not he's not excelling at anything particular except being pretty good at cards and being lucky. That's his main attribute. And one thing before we leave Property of a Lady, I'd like to mention is the characterization, which is incredibly grossly misogynistic of the double agent, where I mean he unleashes so much vitriol on this poor woman who is betraying the country. So I guess he hates her thoroughly, but he just piles it on.
I mean, it's to paraphrase, and I'm paraphrasing it. It basically says that she's a bit of an old boot. Nobody will ever sleep with her, and that's why she's a double agent.
Yeah.
That is basically distilled.
Greasy hair, acne skin, flat chested. He just goes on and on and on. And so, talking about characters, actually, one of the things I find, and this is another departure point from the movies, I think the movies are excellent at building very colorful adversaries for Bond. Whereas Bond tends to do certain sort of grotesques as great adversaries, but they always tend to be quite one note. I mean, you could put Dr. No and Blofeld and Drax and Largo in a big bag and shake it and put your hand in and pull them out, and it'd be hard to tell who you'd got hold of because personality wise, they're all just a sort of snarling, God damn you, Mr. Bond, you've, foiled again. They're not really, he doesn't have any there's no nuance to them. There's no sense that, they're, but for other things, you and I are not so dissimilar, Mr. Bond. There's none of that feeling to them. There's not a Sean Bean amongst them, I guess I'm saying.
It's because he can't help himself. It's even so in Property of a Lady, Bond's mission is to identify this head of the KGB or the head of the thing. And he finds him, and even then, so this is just like a head of the KGB, right? In England, they found him on, what's his description? The hair grew low down on the back of the man's rather squat neck, and the lobes of his ears were pinched in close to his head. He had a slight hump, perhaps only a bone deformation, high up on his back. He can't help himself. It's like as soon as somebody is identified, it's like, and they're really ugly and deformed as well. I just think he can't help himself, to be honest.
It's sort of like, he sees a villain and he says, "Oh, he's perfect physical specimen," and then he turns around, "Oh no, he hasn't got a nose."
Yeah, exactly. And it is that very sort of one note that it explains villains that they're obviously ugly and they all this kind of stuff. They're ugly on the outside and they've been treated dreadfully, so that's why they're ugly on the inside as well.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm sure I'm being unkind. I'm sure we've talked about, we talked about Scaramanga last episode in a way. It was there are interesting elements to them, but he never lets those interesting elements really flourish. I guess the one that I found the most interesting was probably From Russia with Love and Red Grant and the someone who really is a diabolical mirror to Bond.
But he is given a hell of a lot more background than almost any other. He's given almost the entire first third of the story.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's about him. I find Red Grant very, very hard in From Russia with Love. Is that I try and read the books as the books, but I find it very, very, very difficult to disassociate anything of Robert Shaw from the actual. I every time I think of Red Grant and From Russia with Love, even when I'm reading, I at least have to look at the facial features of Robert Shaw because it's too indelible, I think, for me. most of the books I can make that divide, but there are one or two characters I think within Bond where the the cinematic character is too indelible that
Yeah.
you can't just help but mix the two together.
Absolutely, absolutely. Actually, Bond himself is kind of one of the easiest ones to. He feels so different to the films that he's kind of the easiest one to decast, if you like.
I mean, I to be honest, I don't really know what Hoagie Carmichael looks like as much, so it's also a bit easier for me.
Let's go on to the last story, which is The Living Daylights, and this is another story in which Bond is kind of reluctant to kill someone, and indeed doesn't kill someone. And he here we do see him being. I mean, apropos your point earlier, he's out there training because he has to make sure that the weapon is right. He has to make sure the timing is right, and he has to, make sure his eye is in.
I think this is an interesting one because, as you mentioned, the very start of it is again going back to the thing is that Bond needs to practice. He's not preternaturally. He's very good at what he does, but he still needs to put the hours in. You have all the stuff about you should come. Was it the Queen's something? The Queen's contest or whatever it is. You should. But I'm off to look at the file, Mr. J Bond, but he doesn't really exist anymore, and things like that. This person rocking up at 8:15 in the morning because he's got again to do some practice, but people can't know why or how. And I think that there's some really effective scenes in this. And I think that is because this is Bond as, I mean, Le Carre was only just getting started at the time, but this is Le Carre. This is what we'd see more as proper spycraft throughout The Living Daylights. This is traditional. Again, he's in Berlin. I think the only time ever in Berlin that we actually have him in the Fleming books. It's mentioned that he's been there before, but we've never had him there. He's not running down the Reaper Barn or in the middle of five-star hotels. He's in this rundown apartment block, beds up against the thing, has a walk around during the day. But this is, as I say, Le Carre, Buchan, this is old school spy crap.
Considers going to a brothel.
I know. Then that's always a little bit like Bond paying for it, really? Just that's maybe something about Berlin. I don't know. But that's why I really like this story because it is a sort of reflection of what some people don't like Bond because they say it's not spycraft. It's not, you need to read Le Carre or Buchan or somebody like that. This is Bond doing that sort of stuff. I think there's a great moment when that I can't remember the name of the character now. It's my brain has gone funny, but the colonel or the person stationed WB that he's with, remonstrates with him because he's having a whiskey. They have a fight almost and it's almost like somebody going, "Who the bloody hell are you?" This is the Bond of Jamaica and glamorous food and everything like that, rocking into the real spy world. And them going, no, 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 you don't get to drink, you don't get to do this, you don't get to do that. You've got to sit here for hours and hours and behave yourself.
Yeah, I mean, they've got a window of 3 or 4 days, and it's always gonna, as soon as you hear that, it's gonna be the last day. It's not gonna be, and he's kind of doing that thing of boredom. That this is about boredom, which is exactly what George Smiley and the spy who came in from the cold will be about. And also the spy who came in from the cold will sort of end with a similar scene, as you see here, someone trying to cross the Berlin Wall. Alex Lemus, played by Richard Burton in the film there. I can't get rid of that image in my head. Yeah, I love the way he talks about that captain who is basically his spotter, and he sort of says he's in the other room probably having a Horlicks.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like the worst thing that Bond can imagine, while he's drinking a whiskey to steady his nerves.
It does sort of give you the idea of the service being all these sort of the 000 sections are the lucky gits of the service. They get to swan around all these fancy locations.
But this guy, but I was really on Bond's side for this one because that guy's just such a twerp, and when he's sort of like, "I'll have to put it in the report." Sorry, old chap, have to put it in the report. He's getting his revenge via paperwork.
He has given his flowers for for arranging the backfiring of the car. to mask the sound of the shots. Bond is very impressed with him with that.
I love the thing about him working out what the KGB are doing on the other side as well, that the orchestra might all be KGB agents. Like the drum has the searchlight in it, and he sort of works it out via that. I also like there's a little bit of a biographical background, which is kind of, I'm not sure if this is disturbing or not, but the cellist who is the assassin Trigger is based on his half sister.
I don't know if it's based on his half sister, but it's because he actually mentions she might be, but he actually goes something along the lines of, I might have the line somewhere, but she reminded me of that cellist, or I knew of that cellist Amaryllis someone. He actually mentions, does another almost metafictional.
Right. So I names drop her.
He name drops his half sister within it.
But then he talks about, why can't they play that side saddle? Why do they have to? It's sort of it's moving me in strange ways.
It is. I mean, it also goes back to that strangely puppyish Bond,
right?
You sort of talked about. Again, that idea of, I'm James Bond, I'm so cool, and I've got to do this, and she's nice. You know what I mean? Yeah. That sort of sudden change.
Like the captain says, he says, she was a woman, and the captain says, so what? You're supposed to kill her. Of course, it doesn't matter that she's a woman, and it's like, but she was a pretty woman. She was a lady. She was a pretty lady.
And again, I hate to again talk about the films, but because this forms the start of the Dalton film, and Dalton, you sort of understand that. You get this sort of minute idea of why he might have chosen not to kill her. That he's struck by her, but he's also maybe, I don't kill women. Whereas Bond, you've got all this mooning about the park for about 24 hours, 48 hours, when he can't get her face out of his head and all that kind of stuff, that he's going, I just can't stop thinking about her and all this kind of
I wonder if he could be boyfriend, girlfriend. And he sort of has a bit where he's like, probably won't see her again now.
Yeah.
Towards the end, it's like she's probably lost her arm, and, he's heading to a prison camp.
Yeah.
But other than that, do you think she'd be free on Saturday?
Can we have a word with the KGB? Could you pass this note on, please?
Yeah, I heart you. My friend likes you a lot.
Yeah. Sorry about shooting your hand off.
So good. And he also has some time to sort of read some German, kind of a porny thriller as well, to just keep his libido in check.
But I think that's what he's fun about this one. It is just Bond being totally dragged out of the casinos, the sunshine, the everything that has become. Because if we're thinking about 62, so when was Dr. No? 63? So it was before, the cinematic Bond really took traction. It's always interesting about Fleming, about if Fleming had lived, how much would of his work started to mirror the cinematic Bond. It would have been interesting to see how he would have, but really it was only Man with the Golden Gun that sort of was around the same time as when.
On Her Majesty's Secret Service, he mentions Ursula Andress because he got on well with her.
They were filming Dr. No at the time when he was writing that.
Exactly. So, and she turns up as Ursula Andress. He says, when they come down from Gloria Pitts, he says, and there was the American actress, Ursula Andress. She was lovely.
But I'm wondering whether, if he had continued and lived, whether the cinematic Bond as the character that we know would have bled into the literary Bond. Whether suddenly the literary Bond started making more quips and being a bit more. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, because again, I don't think Fleming would ever look a gift horse in the mouth.
No. I think,
if you know what I mean.
Absolutely. I think he would have. He would definitely have done that. I think he had his eye on turning it into a film almost from the second novel on. He was beginning to really hope that they would make a movie. So I think he would. I mean, there's something to be said for him sort of already writing books as if they were movies. I mean, For Your Eyes Only, the they were supposed to be teleplays.
It was James Bond of the Secret Service, wasn't it? There was
Yeah,
this idea that it was going to be called James Bond of the Secret, and each was an episode. Well, it was
exactly.
also that, and it goes back to that thing, I think, of being a journalist and as a writer, his writing style, that he was not opposed to recycling.
Right,
Any scrap
right.
of an idea or any scrap of a thing would get churned back, which again, I think it goes back into that idea of how I personally think Fleming seemed more comfortable when he had, for want of a better word, real things to work with. I don't know if you know the story, I'm sure you do, which is how Casino Royale came to a publisher in the first place.
No, remind me.
It was something, and again, I'm sort of paraphrasing here, so I've not got it 100% correct. So please don't excoriate me on Twitter for, sorry, X, for getting the story wrong. I'm sort of paraphrasing that he did know the publishers of, because he was going to do just Casino Royale privately. It was just going to be for him. He knew a publisher, and he was sat in a club or whatever it was, and he said, "Could you just help me? That I want to think of, basically, I've got somebody who's smoking a cigarette, and you just say she exhaled the cigarette, but I don't want to say exhaled. I want to say something else. Could you help me with that?" And the person went, "You've written a novel, haven't you? You've written a book. Tell me about it." And that's how it all became published. But that exchange reflects something of, maybe, again, these things didn't come naturally to Fleming. You know, it wasn't his thing of the characterization and even some of the plotting. In some of the Bond books, some of the plotting, even for a journalist who should know his stuff, he Felix Leiter's arm was remembered, but he kept forgetting whether his leg had been chewed off or not. He wasn't very
He grew it back, I think.
exactly, and that is much of his editors as it is Fleming. But it was always about how he was given, if he was given facts, he was given people, how much he recycled names. James Bond, for goodness sake. One of the first things he did of naming that character is he didn't go into his literary mind palace. He looked at his bookshelf, and there was Birds of the West Indies.
Yeah, yeah.
This is not a criticism of Fleming per se as a writer or what he did. I think this is just an illustration of how he approached the character and how he approached writing. Because he's a bit like me when I write stuff. He's like, I don't think he liked writing. I think he liked having written. Famously, he said, I never really read books back. He did a first draft and sent it off, and then only would look at it when it came back to him.
I love that thing about names because there's so many times when I was just starting out writing as a teenager, I had so many characters who were called Jimmy Pencil and Robbie Paper, just because of what's right in front of you. Cup of coffee, Jimmy Cup of coffee.
Yeah. And his beautiful girlfriend Ravenna.
So let's go on to the final story of James Bond, and this is 007 in New York. And this is a story I haven't been able to get to read, so you'll have to take it away, Lawrence.
It's a fun little diversion, which is basically Bond has to go to New York to find one of the operatives, I think CIA operatives, to tell her that she's close to being exposed. So he is just flying into New York. He has to spend the day in New York and then go find her. And then he plans the rest of the day meeting up with people, going to various restaurants. It is basically a travelogue, written for Thrilling Cities originally. So it is basically Fleming talking about various restaurants and places in New York and sticking Bond in there to probably give it a bit of a Bondian sellable twist. It goes back to the talking about Bond doing things. It goes back to the bit about Bond doing things. I'll read you something from it because there's a funny little bit. He goes, he would be there by 11:30, then a brief shopping expedition, but a very brief one because nowadays there was little to buy in the shops that wasn't from Europe, except the best garden furniture in the world. And Bond hadn't got a garden. The drugstore, first for half a dozen of Owens incomparable toothbrushes, Hoffritz and Madison Avenue for one of their heavy-tooth Gillette-type razors, so much better than Gillette's own product. Gillette must have pissed him off somehow. Triplers for some of those French golf socks made by Izod's. Scribner's because they're the last great bookshop in New York, and because there was a salesman there with a good nose for thrillers. and then to Abercrombie's to look over the new gadgets, and incidentally make a date with Solange, appropriately employed in their indoor games department for the evening. That is typical Fleming product placements, whatever, semi-free stuff, please. Okay, I think it's a bit overstated when you say semi-free stuff, because I don't think it was. I do think it did do it deliberately as a putting yourself in the world, and especially at that time, going back to post-war austerity and everything like that, just even mentioning things and products felt this amazingly freeing and liberating thing to not have your standard issue government razor or whatever it was. You know what I mean? There was always this, it put you into their world, and it gave that sense of reality to the insanity that was going on around everything. But I did sort of look at that and think of, that is such a classic Bond thing. But it sort of ends, I don't spoilers for anybody who's not read it yet, but it has a very funny ending, because it basically, it was like, New York has everything. New York has not got everything. The consequences of the absent amenity were most distressing for James Bond. Everything went hopelessly wrong, and instead of the dream program, there had to be urgent, embarrassing telephone calls with London headquarters, an untidy meeting at midnight between the skating rink at Rockefeller Center with tears and threats of suicide from the English girl. It's really funny because it just all goes wrong. It doesn't tell you exactly what goes wrong. It's just he had all these plans to go to these lovely places that he described in great detail, and it all goes horribly wrong. And I just think that is quite funny.
Excellent.
But what it does end with, technically, is that there is a line. And if I just find that line, because of course, what does Bond want to go eat at one point?
What could he possibly want to go and eat? What have we learned that he wants to go and eat throughout the whole of the James Bond book club?
He decides to head for scrambled eggs.
Excellent.
And it is mentioned in the text, but there's a little asterisk. And at the end, they have the recipe. So in a way, it seems quite apropos, because this is sort of technically the last thing that Bond's Fleming ever mentioned. Now, I have read that, we talked about it before, but this recipe actually came from Maid Maxwell, who was the housekeeper to Fleming's friend Ivor Bruce, who gave the name to Bond's own housekeeper. Right. So May, in real life, was responsible for the scrambled eggs in the literary world of Bond. And it has
eggs. Is that the recipe?
Eggs. But if everybody's out there and wants to get their pen and papers ready, then it says for 4 individualists, you need 12 fresh eggs, salt and pepper, 5 to 6 ounces of fresh butter. Break the eggs into a bowl, beat thoroughly with a fork and season well. In a small copper or heavy bottomed saucepan, melt 4 ounces of the butter. When melted, pour in the eggs and cook over a very low heat, whisking continuously with a small egg whisk. While the eggs are slightly more moist than you would wish for eating, remove pan from heat, add rest of butter and continue whisking for half a minute, adding the while finely chopped chives or fine herbs. Serve on hot buttered toast in individual copper dishes, for appearance only, with pink champagne, Tattinger, and low music. And if there's any way, I think, to end Fleming's Bond adventures, probably a recipe for scrambled eggs is weirdly but appropriately correct.
I think that's a brilliant place to end everything, really, and maybe who knows, what should we do? Well, is there anything you want to add after that, Laurence? Because I'm sort of, my mouth is watering and I'm thinking of going downstairs and grabbing myself some scrambled eggs.
I think you just need to find the bacon and the hot coffee.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe a Vesper Lind for later on. By that, I mean the cocktail, everybody.
Not the traitorous woman who's going to scar me for life. Brilliant. Well, Laurence, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
It's been most enjoyable. Thank you very much indeed.
The James Bond Book Club will return.